This has been a, a somewhat trying week. A tremendous man of God was assassinated this week. He didn't die. He was murdered. He was assassinated. He was assassinated by a madman. A man who is, according to the news media, is in a relationship with a trans woman. That means he's in a relationship with a man who is going through the change, the transition. And when the transition is over, he'll still be a man. He'll be a mutilated man, but he'll still be a man. But you know, just from a Coach Stewart, from a common sense point of view, if you are a man and you're dating a man, that's homosexuality. That's wrong. But the utter stupidity of it is if you are a man and you have a boyfriend and he's trying to transition to become a woman, which he won't, but if that's what he's trying to do, go along with me now. Don't that mean y'all gonna break up?
A single gunshot echoed across a college quad and turned an ordinary campus debate into a national crisis. Conservative activist Charlie Kirk was fatally shot while speaking at a public event, a shocking act that has sent shockwaves through politics, religion, and media. Please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss future updates. What followed was not just a criminal investigation, but an immediate unraveling of narratives, questions about motive, arguments about free speech, and a fierce tug-of-war over how to remember a public figure whose career had always been polarizing. Within hours, investigators identified and arrested a suspect. Law enforcement sources said the suspect was known to campus security and that forensic evidence, witness statements, and digital records were central to the case. As authorities pieced together a timeline, reporting revealed another thread that many found relevant. The alleged shooter had been involved in a personal relationship with a roommate who identifies as transgender. That intimate detail, private, human, and suddenly public, was seized upon by commentators on every side, hoping to explain motive, to find a pattern, or to make a broader cultural point. The disclosure has only intensified the debate over whether personal relationships and identity can or should be used to interpret a violent act, or whether doing so distracts from the fundamentals of criminal responsibility and due process. From the outset, reactions divided sharply along ideological lines. Many conservative voices condemned the assassination as an attack on free speech and the norms that allow public debate to happen at all. For them, the fatal shooting confirmed a deep fear that political disagreement, when amplified by moral contempt and dehumanizing rhetoric, can become literalized in violence. Vigils and online tributes framed Kirk as someone martyred for confronting campus orthodoxies and cultural trends he believed were harmful. To supporters, his public courage, our readiness to speak in hostile spaces and to press contrary views, was now indistinguishable from witness, and his death a blunt demonstration of why open discourse must be vigorously defended. At the same time, others insisted that condemnation of the killing should not obscure a fuller appraisal of Kirk's public life. Critics pointed to a long record of statements and positions they regard as racially charged or deliberately divisive, language they say made him a lightning rod and helped fashion a climate of antagonism. For these observers, sympathy for the victim did not mean erasing the harm some of his rhetoric caused. Instead, they argued, the tragedy offered an opportunity to interrogate how public figures frame debates about race, gender, and identity, and how those frames reverberate in communities already strained by distrust. This view did not justify violence. It insisted on a twin accountability. The criminal act must be punished, and public discourse must be examined for the ways it may contribute to social fracture. Supporters of Kirk pressed a narrative of principled defiance. They said he spoke truths that others would not, stood against what he and his audience saw as the excesses of campus politics, and refused to back down despite threats and hostility. In memorials and social media posts, many invoked religious language, describing him as a witness to higher truths and framing his unwillingness to stay silent as spiritually courageous. This interpretation collapsed politics and faith into a single storyline, a man willing to suffer for convictions, now taken from his community by violence. That framing energized rallies and fundraising, and it became a focal point for conservatives who see cultural institutions failing to protect dissenting voices. Yet the killing did not produce universal sympathy. It reopened a bitter public argument about memory and moral evaluation. Critics were quick to say that any memorialization should include an honest accounting of past remarks that some considered racist, transphobic, or otherwise harmful. They argued that selective mourning, elevating the fallen while minimizing prior divisiveness, polishes a public image at the expense of victims of rhetoric and policy. These debates played out not only on cable networks and talk radio but inside churches, where believers wrestled with how to balance compassion for a life lost against the obligation to speak truth about injustice and harm. Religious leaders and congregations were among the most visibly torn. Some pastors and church members focused on the human tragedy and urged grief, reconciliation, and prayer as the proper responses. Others insisted that faith demands candor. Grieving does not require whitewashing a legacy. That cleavage reflected deeper fault lines in Christian communities about how faith intersects with politics. For some churches, the killing became a rallying cry about religious liberty and the perils of censorious culture. For others, it was a call to repentance and reflection about how communal speech can either uplift or wound those on the margins. Prominent clerics publicly pushed back against any effort to sanctify Kirk without acknowledging the contested elements of his record. Notably, Pastor Jamal Bryant and others made clear that honoring a life does not require ignoring past statements they consider racist. They refused to allow grief to become an excuse for celebrating rhetoric that dehumanizes. Those comments set off a new round of debate. Supporters accused critics of coldness and opportunism. Critics accused supporters of hypocrisy and selective memory. The net effect was to transform places of worship into arenas for cultural conflict, with pulpit statements and congregational comments rapidly amplified across social platforms. The media landscape only intensified the churn. Different outlets emphasized different aspects of the story. Some foreground the criminal investigation and evidence, others focused on the accused shooter's personal relationships, and still others analyzed the political symbolism of the attack. Disinformation networks and opportunistic actors amplified narratives tailored to their constituencies, producing competing timelines and conspiratorial rifts that made it harder for the public to find a stable, factual anchor. That chaotic information environment posed a serious challenge to civic calm. When facts blur and interpretations harden, grievance grows and sympathy calcifies into tribal solidarity. Beyond the immediate political contest, the assassination of Charlie Kirk forced Americans to confront questions that cut far deeper than party lines or cultural loyalties. The shock of seeing a college campus, a place meant for learning, questioning, and dialogue, turned into the site of lethal violence made safety an urgent concern. Universities, once viewed as bastions of open debate, now faced a dilemma: how to continue hosting speakers who spark controversy without putting students, faculty, and visitors at risk. In the days that followed, calls for heightened security measures grew louder. Advocates pushed for mandatory bag checks, controlled entry points, and larger police presence at public lectures, pointing to this tragedy as proof that institutions had not kept pace with rising political hostility. But not everyone agreed. Critics of securitization warned that transforming debates into heavily policed spectacles would come with its own costs. Turning every public forum into a fortress, they argued, would chill participation and reinforce a climate of fear rather than foster genuine discussion. Students in particular expressed concern that heightened surveillance would change the very character of academic life, pushing universities further away from their mission of open inquiry and toward an environment where speech feels dangerous and dissent feels unsafe. What was once designed to be a space of robust argument could too easily become a guarded compound where only the most cautious voices dare to speak. This clash revealed a deeper truth. There is no simple legislative or administrative fix for the kind of cultural fracture now on display. While lawmakers and campus administrators debated policy responses, from tougher penalties for political violence to new guidelines for hosting guest speakers, many observers pointed out that the roots of the problem are not primarily institutional but cultural. The crisis, they said, grows out of widespread alienation, the echo chambers of online life, and the erosion of shared civic norms. Even the most sweeping campus safety plan cannot repair a society that no longer agrees on how to disagree. On the moral plane, this episode struck a nerve. For many Americans, Kirk's assassination became stark evidence of a fraying public ethic. If disagreement can so quickly escalate to deadly consequences, then the incentives for careful argument, listening, and mutual respect collapse. It becomes easier to see opponents not as fellow citizens to debate, but as existential threats to be silenced. That shift corrodes the very foundation of democratic life. Whether one viewed Kirk as a martyr for free speech or as a public figure whose rhetoric carried consequences, the outcome was the same: a nation forced to reckon with the language it uses, the tolerance it shows, and the way grief itself has become contested territory. The reactions made clear how polarized even mourning has become. Funerals, vigils, and memorials are no longer protected from political meaning. To supporters, Kirk's death was the silencing of a courageous voice, a Christian witness willing to endure hostility for the sake of truth. To critics, his death did not absolve the pain his words had caused. To grieve without acknowledging his controversial record, they argued, would be dishonest. What should have been a moment of shared sorrow became another front in the culture war, where even gestures of remembrance were parsed for partisan implications. That reality leads to several unsettling but unavoidable takeaways. First, violence cannot and must not be tolerated as a mechanism for resolving disagreement. The promise of democratic life rests on the conviction that our public spaces, especially universities, churches, and community centers, must be places where ideas are contested with words, not weapons. To allow political violence to creep into these spaces is to abandon the very premise of free society. Second, the way people respond to death has itself become politicized. Mourning is no longer a purely human act. It is often folded into partisan identity and ideological performance. The question is no longer simply, how do we grieve? But, what does our grief signal about our politics? That shift erodes the possibility of common ground. Shared human sorrow, once a bridge across difference, becomes another tool in the arsenal of division. Third, religious communities, traditionally sources of solace in times of tragedy, have become central battlegrounds in this debate. Churches and faith leaders are not neutral mediators. Their stances reveal, and in turn shape, the moral contours of public life. Some pastors invoked Kirk's death as a call to defend liberty and truth, while others cautioned against glorifying a figure whose rhetoric they considered damaging. Congregations split, sermons went viral, and the pulpit became as contested as the political arena. In moments like this, faith institutions are reminded that silence is not neutral. Whatever is said or left unsaid carries weight in shaping the national conscience. Finally, this episode underscores how fragile America's consensus about disagreement has become. For centuries, the country has prided itself on being a place where even the most passionate disputes could be aired openly, with the understanding that disagreement was not fatal but foundational. That consensus is now unraveling. Increasingly, to disagree is to risk being demonized, and once demonization becomes the norm, violence is never far behind. The assassination of Charlie Kirk was not only a crime against one man, it was a warning flare for a society at risk of losing the habits that keep democratic conflict nonviolent. In practical terms, the tragedy demands two kinds of response. On one hand, there is the sober work of criminal justice. Investigators must carefully follow the evidence, courts must weigh the facts, and justice must be served without shortcuts or sensationalism. That process is essential, but it addresses only the surface. On the other hand, there is the harder and more uncomfortable work of cultural reflection. Communities must learn to resist the temptation of simplistic narratives that obscure truth. Media figures must separate verified fact from speculation, and leaders across politics, religion, and education must model speech that is vigorous but not dehumanizing. The weeks and months ahead will test whether this moment becomes a turning point toward renewed civic restraint or simply another entry in an accelerating spiral of polarization. Much depends on whether leaders take seriously the responsibility to repair public norms, to protect the right to speak freely, to resist the degradation of language, and to demonstrate that respectful disagreement is still possible. These are not abstract ideals, they are the practical conditions for a functioning democracy. For those who knew and loved Kirk personally, his family, his friends, and his colleagues, the most immediate need is space to mourn without their grief being turned into political spectacle. They deserve care, not co-optation. For the broader nation, the need is different but no less urgent. A recommitment to a public square that can tolerate the uncomfortable, hold fierce debates without fear, and honor the dignity of those who stand on opposite sides of the aisle. If any lasting lesson emerges from this painful episode, it is that preserving democracy requires more than protecting speech in the abstract. It requires protecting dissent in practice, and it requires guarding the dignity of those we oppose. Words must replace weapons, civility must outlast rage, and debate must be fierce but never fatal. Only then can a fractured nation begin to heal, and only then can the promise of democracy survive its current test. Please subscribe to stay updated on future developments and deeper coverage.